There are men whose names linger in history, not as memories, but as warnings. Idi Amin Dada is one of them. For a brief decade in the 1,970 seconds, he ruled Uganda with a smile that could freeze blood. To the world, he was a caricature, a giant in uniform who joked with reporters, boxed before cameras, and grinned beside foreign dignitaries. But beneath that grin, a machinery of terror turned day into nightmare. In the name of order, he unmade his nation. In the name of faith, he listened to ghosts that demanded blood. He called himself the last king of Scotland, lord of all beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, conqueror of the British Empire. Behind these absurd titles lay a truth far more frightening, a man who believed his own myth. He was adored by some, feared by nearly all, and understood by almost no one. Amin's Uganda became a stage on which cruelty was performed with ceremony. Trains carried the expelled Asian families through silent stations, mothers clutching bundles, children too young to know why they were leaving. The same night, bodies drifted down Lake Victoria, bloated and faceless, reminders of loyalty gone wrong. At Entebbe Airport, the world watched as hostages were taken and rescued, and Amin's name burned across headlines once more. Half tyrant, half fool, all human ruin. How does a boy from the farthest edge of the British Empire, a herdsman's son who once recited the Quran by memory, become the butcher of his own people? Was he born cruel, or did the empire's steel teach him to wield violence like faith? And how much of what we remember is truth, and how much is the echo of fear itself? This is not only a story of one man's descent into monstrosity. It is also a mirror held to the century, the experiments of empire, the arrogance of power, the fragility of nations newly freed. Uganda in the 1,970 seconds was a country learning independence the hard way, and its teacher wore a uniform with medals he invented for himself. To tell this story, we will move slowly through barracks and palace halls, through laughter that hides dread, through jungles and rivers that remember more than people do. We will hear the voices that history silenced, and the quieter truths behind the noise of legend. Because in the end, Idi Amin is not just a headline from another continent. He is a question that never stops echoing. What happens when charisma devours conscience, and when a nation forgets how to wake from its own dream of strength? No one remembers the exact day he was born. Between 1,925 and 1,928, in the dusty borderland town of Koboko in northwestern Uganda, a boy named Idi was brought into a world already marked by hunger and heat. The British Empire drew invisible lines through these lands, dividing people who still shared the same rivers, the same drums. Among them lived the Kakwa, small in number, proud in survival, speaking softly and believing deeply in spirits older than any flag. Idi's mother, Ate, was a traditional healer, a woman both feared and needed. People came to her with fevers, with curses, with dreams they didn't understand. To the boy, her hut was a theater of whispers, bottles of herbs, small bones tied with thread, a fire that never went out. From her, he learned silence, the art of listening before speaking. From the mullah who visited their village, he learned rhythm, the cadence of Arabic recitation, the words of the Quran that he could repeat by memory long before he could read them. By his early teens, Idi Amin had earned a small reputation in the nearby mosques. He could chant entire surahs with a clear, booming voice, his tone more commanding than tender. For this, he once received a local prize, a Quran wrapped in cloth, a token of pride that he carried until it fell apart. Yet the world beyond the village offered little more than fields, goats, and long afternoons of labor. His father left when he was young. His mother's healing brought barely enough grain to trade. Like many boys of his generation, Idi began to drift south in search of work. He found himself in Lugazi, at the Imperial Hotel, a place built to house the comfort of colonial officials, where Ugandans entered only to clean, carry, or bow. There, as a teenage porter, Idi wore a borrowed coat too short for his arms. He fetched tea, brushed dust from boots, and learned how to watch without being seen. The guests spoke English he did not understand, but he listened for tone and gesture, the signs of command, of fear, of deference. Language, he realized, was not only words. Standing 6 feet tall before he turned 20, he was an imposing figure, broad-shouldered, silent, and obedient. The hotel staff joked that he was built like an elephant, but moved like someone waiting for orders. One day, a British officer named William Bobby T remembered him differently. The officer saw not just a porter, but a potential soldier, uneducated enough to obey, strong enough to endure, fluent in Kiswahili, the lingua franca of the British colonial troops in East Africa. Amin's recruitment in 1946 was less a choice than a direction offered by fate and empire. To the officer, it was routine, one name among many in the King's African Rifles intake list. To Idi, it was something more, a door opening into a world of order, food, and the illusion of belonging. He left Lugazi carrying a single bundle, one shirt, a pair of sandals, and the torn Quran from his boyhood. The barracks at Magamaga were the first place where he learned how power could be worn like a uniform. The sound of drums gave way to the sound of boots, and the boy who once recited verses beneath the stars began to march to other rhythms, those of empire, discipline, and quiet obedience. When Idi first entered the army, he did not touch a rifle. His hands, already calloused from years of labor, were put to washing uniforms at the Magamaga barracks, scrubbing sweat and dust from the shirts of men who barked orders in accents he barely understood. The smell of soap, damp cloth, and metal filled his days. Yet even from the laundry yard, he studied everything: the precision of drills, the crisp salute, the rhythm of command. There was a world inside those gates, orderly, powerful, and absolute, and he wanted to belong to it. In 1947, he was transferred to the 21st King's African Rifles, the colonial regiment built to enforce Britain's will across East Africa. The pay was meager, but the uniform mattered. It carried dignity, or at least the appearance of it. Among the ranks, soldiers were divided not only by rank, but by color. White officers gave orders. Black soldiers obeyed. For a man like Amin, the rulebook was clear. Obedience was the shortest road upward. His first real mission came in Somalia, hunting down shifter raiders, bandits, rebels, or freedom fighters, depending on who told the story. The patrols were grueling. Days under the merciless sun, nights echoing with gunfire and hyenas. Amin, tall and tireless, impressed his superiors with his courage. But there was something else they noticed too: a harshness toward prisoners, a quickness to use violence when fear might have sufficed. Some officers called it zeal, others whispered cruelty. He returned to Kenya and trained with the Fort Hall Scottish Band, an experiment by the colonial forces to blend order with spectacle. There, among bagpipes and brass, Idi discovered something new: the stage. He learned to march in rhythm, to perform strength as if it were theater. It would become one of his greatest weapons. By the time he turned 20, Amin had become a physical legend among his peers. 6'4", weighing more than 240 pounds. He could lift another man with one arm. He boxed like a storm, swift and merciless, earning the title of Uganda's light heavyweight champion. He swam across rivers where others feared crocodiles, and on the rugby field, he was a charging force no one wished to stop. Reports from British officers described him in contradictory tones. One called him an extraordinary man, fearless, ambitious, a natural leader. Another wrote, less kindly, a splendid athlete, but bone from the neck up needs things explained in words of one letter. He was seen as both simple and cunning, obedient and unpredictable. Those contradictions followed him, deepening as the years advanced. He could joke with the officers and terrify his subordinates in the same breath. He could smile as he punished. Even in those early days, the shape of his rule could be traced faintly in his instincts: loyalty to power, suspicion of mercy, and a fascination with fear itself. Some men are born to authority, others learn to mimic it until it becomes second nature. By the late 1942, Idi Amin was learning quickly that power was not only something one earned, it was something one performed. By the early 1952, East Africa was burning. In the highlands of Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising had begun, part rebellion, part desperate cry for land and dignity after decades of British rule. The colonial forces called it insurgency, but to many Africans, it was the sound of a people remembering their stolen home. Idi Amin, now in his early 20s and already promoted to corporal, was sent with his unit to the forests around Mount Kenya. The king's African rifles patrolled muddy trails thick with mist and fear. The rebels moved like smoke, striking then vanishing, leaving the soldiers chasing shadows. Amin, towering above most, cut a strange figure in that green maze, silent, tireless, and unshaken by the sight of blood. His commanders praised his stamina, his willingness to go where others hesitated. He seemed to thrive in the chaos. Some of the men whispered that he didn't just obey orders, he enjoyed them. Stories followed. Captured fighters beaten past recognition. Villages punished for harboring rebels. It was said that when Amin interrogated, no one ever lied twice. Whether rumor or truth, his reputation hardened into something useful to the British, a soldier who got results, no matter the method. By 1953, he had been promoted to sergeant. That was as high as a black African could officially climb under the colonial system. The next rank, effendi, or warrant officer, was an honorary ceiling, a gesture that pretended equality without granting power. For Amin, who had come from scrubbing uniforms to commanding men, even that token rank felt like proof that he was meant for more. Life on campaign left its marks beyond the battlefield. In Kenya, he fathered 2 children, a boy and a girl, with a local woman. He never stayed long enough to watch them grow. The war, the promotions, and the endless orders kept him moving. Duty, or perhaps ambition, always called louder than affection. When the Mau Mau were finally crushed, Amin's unit returned to Uganda. They marched into Jinja like returning heroes, polished boots glinting in the sunday. Crowds watched from the roadside. Children stared at the uniforms that seemed to carry foreign magic. At the parades, Amin stood straight as a flagpole, chest broad, eyes steady, proud in the way only the newly powerful can be. But power, in a colonial army, was a fragile illusion. In 1957, Amin joined a movement among native soldiers, demanding higher pay, an act of courage, or perhaps naive hope. The request failed. The officers were displeased, and Amin's name was quietly marked. Twice he sat for the army intelligence test. Twice he failed. The rumor spread that he was brave but simple, a man better suited for muscle than mind. And yet he did not stop trying. In 1959, during a field exercise exam, he finally passed barely, but enough to return to combat command. The British could not ignore his effectiveness, even when they distrusted his instincts. That same year, he was posted again, this time to the wild borderlands between Kenya and Uganda, a region where cattle, pride, and politics often collided. The young sergeant who once scrubbed shirts now carried the weight of command. marching toward a frontier where his ruthlessness would find both purpose and opportunity. The border between Kenya and Uganda was not a line drawn in sand, it was a wound that never healed. To the east lived the Turkana, to the west the Karimojong, both pastoral peoples who measured wealth not by money but by cattle and courage. Between them stretched dry plains of thorn and dust, a land that belonged to whoever was strong enough to hold it that week. When Idi Amin was posted there in 1959, he entered a world older and more ruthless than the empire he served. British patrols had recently suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Turkana raiders. Dozens of cattle stolen, soldiers ambushed, pride shattered. The colonial officers needed someone who could restore their authority, someone who could speak the local languages of fear and command. Amin was sent to do it. He did not disappoint. Arriving with his men under the burning sky, he ordered retaliatory patrols that swept through the borderlands like storms. Villages suspected of aiding the Turkana were surrounded, herds seized, men beaten, sometimes worse. When warnings failed, Amin gave the kind of order that froze even his own troops. Every Turkana man caught rustling cattle would be castrated on the spot. At first, his soldiers thought it was bluff. Then they watched him carry it out. The message spread faster than the patrols themselves. By nightfall, fires flickered across the plains. Signal or morning, no one could tell. To the British, it was efficiency. To the locals, it was terror given uniform. Yet Amin did not rely only on violence. After the killing came the theatre. He summoned Edward Mutea, a respected Turkana leader, to negotiate. The meeting took place beneath an acacia tree, watched by both tribes and a handful of British officers. Amin spoke in Kiswahili, mixing threats with gestures of friendship, promising peace if the raids ended, ruin if they did not. He smiled as he spoke, the way a man smiles before throwing a knife. Mutea, perhaps sensing the futility of defiance, agreed to terms. A peace was declared, one written not on paper, but in silence and submission. Reports sent back to Kampala praised Amin for restoring the prestige of law and order. His superiors admired his results, even if his methods made them uneasy. The empire always preferred order, no matter the cost of achieving it. It was after Karamoja that Idi Amin was promoted to lieutenant. For a boy who once washed other men's uniforms, it was a dizzying ascent. He wore his new insignia with the pride of someone who believed destiny had finally recognized him. In his mind, fear was not cruelty, it was control, and control was the only language the world respected. The British officers noted his charisma, his brute intelligence, his ability to command through both charm and menace. They wrote that he was a man of promise, though none could guess what kind of promise it would become. In the dust and heat of that borderland, Amin discovered his formula for power: spectacle, punishment, and the performance of strength. He had learned that people obeyed not the man who shouted the loudest, but the one who could make silence feel dangerous. And so, on the farthest edge of empire, a young lieutenant found his true weapon, not his rifle, but fear itself. In 1962, the Union Jack was lowered over Kampala for the last time. Uganda, green and restless, had finally won its independence. The drums in the hills beat deep into the night, but beneath the celebration was unease. The British had left their roads, their schools, and their army, an army still trained in their image, still breathing their discipline, still built to obey. Idi Amin, now in his mid-30s, stood among those soldiers watching a flag of black, yellow, and red rise into the sky. For him, freedom was not an idea, it was an opportunity. He had already proven himself in the field, and in the new Uganda, that counted for much. By 1964, just 2 years after independence, Amin was appointed Deputy Commander of the National Army, a staggering leap for a man who once laundered its uniforms. He moved through ranks not by politics or pedigree, but by the sheer gravity of his presence. Men followed him because he was impossible to ignore. That same year, his troops crossed the border into the Congo. The mission, ordered by Prime Minister Milton Obote, was to assist Congolese nationalists against foreign-backed mercenaries. But the plan faltered. The Ugandan soldiers, poorly supplied and uncertain whom to trust, were forced back. It was Amin's first failure, though he framed it as endurance, a campaign betrayed by others, not lost by him. Rumors soon followed him home. Stories of smuggled ivory and Congolese gold, of secret deals struck in border towns. Amin was said to have profited from the very chaos he was sent to contain. Whether true or exaggerated, the whispers reached the capital. Yet Obote, pragmatic and wary, did not dismiss him. He needed a strong man, someone whose loyalty could outshout scandal. And Amin, with his mix of soldier's instinct and showman's confidence, fit the part. Then came 1966, a year that would decide the shape of Uganda's future. The fragile alliance between Obote, the northern politician, and King Mutesa II, the monarch of Buganda, had begun to fracture. Obote accused the royal household of plotting a coup. The air thickened with suspicion, and the city's silence turned electric. When Obote finally struck, it was Amin he sent. Tanks rolled toward the royal palace on Mengo Hill, their barrels glinting beneath a stormy sky. Amin led the assault himself. Shots cracked through the night as the Bugandan royal guard fought hopelessly to defend their king. Walls shattered, gates splintered. Inside, King Mutesa fled through a back passage, escaping into exile in London. The next morning, Kampala awoke to smoke and certainty. The monarchy was over, and in that smoke, the legend of Idi Amin was born. He had proven that in moments of crisis, he would act without hesitation, without question, without mercy. Obote called him "my trusted soldier." Others began to call him something else, a man too comfortable with chaos, too eager to use the gun when words would do. Still, promotion followed. Power always finds those who do what others fear to do. In the young nation's march toward its uncertain future, Amin was already walking ahead, his boots leaving deep prints on the path between loyalty and ambition. By 1967, the young nation of Uganda was no longer celebrating its independence. It was learning how fragile freedom could be. The euphoria of the flag's first flight had faded into tension, rumors, and the steady rhythm of boots. In the barracks, one man's voice carried louder than the rest. Idi Amin had become commander of the Ugandan army. He was, by all appearances, Obote's most loyal soldier, a mountain of a man with medals that shone like small suns. To the outside world, their alliance seemed unbreakable. The politician and his enforcer, the strategist and the strong arm. But within the walls of State House, unease grew. Obote could feel it, the way power had begun to tilt toward the barracks, the way soldiers saluted Amin before they saluted him. For Amin, command was a stage as much as an office. He took English classes at Makerere University, learning to speak the language of his former masters. Later, he would even boast of earning a doctorate there, an invention perhaps, or a misunderstanding turned myth. But what mattered was the performance. A general who could play the gentleman when it suited him, and the executioner when it didn't. His methods unsettled many within the ruling Uganda People's Congress. Reports came in of soldiers beaten for minor offenses, villages raided under pretexts of security operations, and the army quietly swelling with recruits from Amin's own tribes, the Kakwa and Nubians men, whose loyalty was to him first, and the state second. Then came the Okoya affair. Brigadier Pierino Okoya, another high-ranking officer, was found murdered along with his wife. The killings shocked the country. Though evidence was scarce, suspicion pointed toward Amin's circle. Okoye had criticized him publicly, calling him reckless. Obote ordered an inquiry, but it went nowhere. Fear had already entered the bloodstream of the government. By 1969, whispers of corruption joined the growing chorus of dread. Amin was accused of misusing millions from the army's operations fund, money meant for campaigns and logistics, now untraceable. When confronted, he deflected with charm, laughter, and a soldier's salute. Yet behind the grin, he was calculating. He knew Obote's patience was thinning, and that his own power no longer rested on obedience, but on the loyalty of the guns pointed outward and inward. The president began to plan his removal quietly, gathering dossiers, considering charges. In 1970, Obote made his move. He dismissed Amin as army chief and prepared to prosecute him for corruption and abuse of authority. For most men, that would have been the end. But Amin was not most men. Instead of retreating, he slipped away from the capital, moving between military camps under the pretense of inspection tours. He visited the units filled with his own tribesmen, the men who owed their promotions and their families' safety to him. He spoke softly to them, promised protection, hinted that danger was coming, not from enemies abroad, but from their own government. By the time Obote realized what was happening, it was already too late. The army's pulse no longer beat to his command. Amin had transformed from soldier to storm a force that could no longer be ordered, only awaited. The morning of January 25th, 1971, began like any other in Kampala, warm, busy, unaware that history was about to turn. By nightfall, the city would wake to the thunder of tanks, and Uganda would belong to a new ruler. While President Milton Obote attended a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, Idi Amin struck. For weeks, he had been quietly shifting his men, drawing support from Rwandan rebels and units already loyal to him. When the first shots rang out, resistance was brief, almost ceremonial. Soldiers who might have fought hesitated. Many had long since chosen their side. Within hours, Radio Uganda broadcast the announcement. Major General Idi Amin had taken control of the nation. The city erupted in cheers. Crowds poured into the streets, dancing around the rumbling convoys. "Obote is gone," they shouted. "Amin will bring peace." For a people weary of suspicion, arrests, and political feuds, the change felt like release. Across the country, even the churches rang their bells. Foreign governments, too, breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Obote had grown hostile toward the West, leaning toward socialist allies. Amin, by contrast, was known as a man who loved sport, laughter, and order, a soldier's soldier. London, Washington, and Tel Aviv all sent polite congratulations, seeing in him a stabilizing figure, a buffer against Soviet influence. None yet saw the storm behind the smile. In his first speeches, Amin played the part of the gentle giant. He promised that his rule was only temporary, a caretaker government, lasting no more than 18 months. He vowed to restore democracy, free political prisoners, and dissolve the feared secret police. He visited hospitals, mosques, and marketplaces, shaking hands and bowing his enormous head as photographers flashed. For a while, hope returned. Newspapers called him the People's General. On radio, his voice was calm, even fatherly. He told listeners, "Uganda will now live in peace, without fear." And for a moment, the people believed him. But power has its own gravity. 18 months became 5 years. The caretaker became the king. Slowly, quietly, Amin tightened his grip. Opponents began to disappear. The army swelled again, more Kakwa, more Nubians, more men who called him Big Daddy. Then came the titles. At first, They were almost comical. His Excellency, the President, the Commander of the Armed Forces. But soon they grew absurd, baroque, godlike. His Excellency Field Marshal Al-Haji, Dr. Idi Amin Dada, VC, DSO, MC, Lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea, conqueror of the British Empire and King of Scotland. He wore them like armor. They were a performance of invincibility, a shield against doubt. In the newspapers, he grinned beside boxing trophies and foreign dignitaries. Yet behind every smile lay a calculation. Power must never look uncertain, even for a second. For the first time, the laughter that followed Amin carried an edge of unease. The people who had once danced in the streets now whispered before speaking his name. The door to freedom had been kicked open with joy, but when it closed again, it locked from the inside. It began, as so many of Amin's decisions did, with a dream. In August 1972, he announced that God had spoken to him in the night and given him an instruction. The Asians of Uganda must leave. 70,000 people, shopkeepers, engineers, teachers, entire families were ordered to pack their lives into 90 days. For generations, they had formed the economic backbone of the country, descendants of Indians brought by the British to build railways and manage trade. They spoke Luganda and English. Their children grew up beside African neighbors, and many held British passports. But Amin saw them differently. He called them bloodsuckers, accusing them of draining Uganda's wealth and plotting against its people. In speeches broadcast over crackling radios, he sounded almost tender. God has told me, he said, that the Asians are sabotaging the economy of our beloved nation. They must go back to where they came from. To some, it was madness. To others, divine revelation. The order was absolute. Each person was given 3 months to leave the country, allowed to carry only what they could hold in their hands. Everything else, shops, factories, cars, homes, was to be distributed among loyal Ugandans. Amin called it an act of justice. In truth, it was an act of plunder dressed in prophecy. At the Entebbe airport, families lined up beneath the burning sun, their luggage stacked like gravestones. British officials tried to arrange evacuation flights as Ugandan soldiers rummaged through their belongings, confiscating jewelry, currency, anything of value. The scenes were a quiet exodus. Tears, fear, silence. The streets that once smelled of spice and fabric now stood empty. Shutters closed over vanished lives. The economic collapse began almost immediately. The expelled community had controlled much of the nation's trade and industry. Overnight, supply chains crumbled. Markets stood bare. Factories rusted. The new owners, Amin's allies and relatives, lacked experience but not greed. Within months, warehouses emptied, fuel ran dry, and the Ugandan shilling began to fall like rain. Abroad, the world recoiled. Britain froze aid and broke diplomatic relations. Israel, once a close military partner, withdrew completely after Jewish residents were expelled alongside the British. The embassies shut their doors. In their place came new friends, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Soviet Union. Amin played his alliances like a juggler, one hand raised in Islamic devotion, the other reaching for weapons and loans. He made a show of converting Uganda's administration toward Islam, renaming streets, attending mosque in full regalia, quoting the Quran between threats. Gaddafi sent him funds and aircraft. Moscow provided rifles and uniforms. To the West, he was now a pariah. To himself, he was chosen a prophet of purification, remaking Uganda by force of will. Yet as the airplanes lifted into the white heat of the sky, carrying away an entire community, the country they left behind began to hollow. Shops stood silent. Machines stopped turning. The laughter of children vanished from the schoolyards. Uganda was not being purified, it was being emptied. Terror does not arrive with fanfare. It grows quietly, like mold in a sealed room. By the mid-1970s, Amin's Uganda had become such a room, airless, afraid, and always listening. The purges began inside the army. Amin, once surrounded by officers who had fought beside him, now saw only potential traitors. He announced that certain soldiers would receive special training in subversion techniques at Makindi prison. 36 officers reported for duty, dressed in their best uniforms, expecting drills and lectures. Instead, they were locked in cells. That night, the guards came with bayonets. By morning, Makindi was silent. Soon after, Brigadier Suleiman Hussein, a man who had once commanded great respect, was arrested. His crime was never clearly stated. Some said he questioned Amin's orders. Others whispered that his loyalty had simply become inconvenient. In prison, he was beaten to death by his own men. His head was severed and delivered to Amin's residence in Kampala. Witnesses later claimed the dictator kept it in a refrigerator, a grotesque trophy of power. Whether true or exaggerated, the story captured the truth that mattered. Fear itself had become a form of governance. The killings grew methodical. At Mbarara barracks, top officers were told to line up and salute a motorcade of tanks. As the vehicles approached, they swerved deliberately, crushing men beneath their treads. Survivors were shot. At another base, officers were summoned to attend a lecture from their president. When the doors closed, grenades rolled across the floor. Within months, nearly every senior officer, not from Amin's own Kakwa or Nubian clans, was dead. Their replacements were loyalists, uneducated, unquestioning, bound to Amin by fear and blood. In this new army, obedience was not expected, it was enforced. Outside the barracks, terror seeped into the streets. The State Research Bureau, originally a small intelligence office, expanded into a vast network of secret police. Detainees vanished into its cells at Nakasero and Makindi, rarely to return. Bodies began appearing in ditches, on riverbanks, and most often, in the waters of Lake Victoria. Fishermen spoke of nets snagging on something heavy. The lake, once a source of life, became Uganda's unmarked grave. Ordinary people adapted by speaking softly, avoiding eye contact, pretending not to see. Neighbors vanished overnight. Names were erased from workplace rosters. Silence was survival. And yet, amid the horror, stories grew stranger tales of Amin's appetite for human flesh, of dinners interrupted by acts too cruel to repeat. Foreign journalists whispered, "Cannibal." Diplomats repeated it in bars. Evidence was elusive, but the rumor thrived because it felt symbolically true. A ruler devouring his own country. What can be verified is grim enough. Amin's cruelty was theatrical. He turned violence into spectacle, staging punishments to remind the nation who owned it. Each act was both execution and performance. He believed fear was not merely a tool, it was the glue that kept the country from falling apart. But fear cannot hold forever. Beneath the surface of obedience, Uganda trembled. And though the dictator's laughter still echoed through the radio, the machinery of terror was already grinding itself toward collapse. By the mid-1970s, Idi Amin no longer ruled Uganda alone, he performed it. The country had become his stage, and the world his uneasy audience. He adored the theater of diplomacy. In front of cameras, he was jovial and unpredictable, a towering man in bright uniforms, medals clinking like applause. As chairman of the Organization of African Unity in 1975, he paraded himself as the continent's loudest voice against the West. He condemned colonialism in English, polished by his speechwriters, while quietly collecting weapons from both Moscow and Tripoli. He even declared himself head of the British Commonwealth, as if the empire he once served now bowed before him. To complete the illusion, he awarded himself the Victoria Cross. Abroad, many laughed, but within Uganda, laughter had long since turned to fear. When not hosting visiting dignitaries or boxing for cameras, Amin courted chaos on his borders. Small skirmishes flared with Tanzania after a boat, now in exile there, began plotting a return. Villages were shelled, civilians fled. Amin retaliated loudly, then offered to mediate peace in Northern Ireland, insisting he could solve the British problem better than the British themselves. He also embraced the Palestinian cause, befriending the PLO and denouncing Israel as the real enemy of Africa. His rhetoric earned him applause in Tripoli, cold silence elsewhere. But what began as political theatre would soon turn deadly. In June 1976, an Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris was hijacked by members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, along with 2 German accomplices. The hijackers demanded the release of dozens of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel. Their chosen destination for this negotiation was shocking: Entebbe Airport, Uganda. Amin welcomed them personally. He offered the hijackers support, fuel, and soldiers to guard the 256 hostages. State radio broadcast his smiling reassurances that Uganda will guarantee their safety. Photographs showed him touring the terminal, shaking hands with captors, waving at terrified passengers. For the cameras, he was benevolent, even fatherly. In truth, he had aligned Uganda with an act of international terror. Among the hostages was Dora Bloch, an elderly British-Israeli woman who had choked on food and was taken to a hospital in Kampala. She never returned. Meanwhile, in Israel, the response was swift. The architects of the original Entebbe airport still had its blueprints designed years earlier by Israeli engineers. Within days, a daring rescue mission was underway. On the night of July 3rd, as Ugandans slept, 4 Hercules transport planes flew low across the Red Sea, lights off, radar silent. When they landed, Israeli commandos stormed the terminal in a burst of gunfire and confusion. In under an hour, 102 hostages were freed. 3 were killed, along with 7 hijackers and roughly 40 Ugandan soldiers. Among the rescuers, 1 died, Lieutenant Colonel Yonatan Netanyahu. It was a stunning success, broadcast worldwide before dawn. The world cheered Israel's precision. Uganda was left humiliated. Amin's fury was volcanic. He raged on television, accusing foreign powers of violating Ugandan sovereignty. With no Israelis left to punish, he turned inward. Soldiers burst into the hospital where Dora Bloch lay recovering, dragged her away, and killed her. Her body was later found in the woods outside Kampala. Whatever illusion of statesmanship Amin had cultivated collapsed that week. The self-proclaimed King of Scotland was no longer a colourful eccentric. He was revealed as an accomplice to terror and a murderer of the helpless. The laughter of the world curdled into disgust. And yet, even then, he did not fall silent. He doubled down, building monuments to himself, delivering speeches about destiny, insisting that history would vindicate him. But outside the palace walls, the drums of war were beginning again, this time not in celebration, but in approach. By the late 1972, the bright colors of Amin's regime had begun to fade. The uniforms were still pressed, the parade still staged, but the country underneath was unraveling. Markets stood bare. Petrol queues coiled like snakes along the roadside. Inflation soared while wages shrank to dust. The laughter that once followed Amin's bluster was gone. Now, when the radio carried his voice, people listened the way one listens to thunder waiting for the storm that must follow. Corruption devoured what the purges had spared. Ministers enriched themselves as hospitals emptied of medicine and schools of chalk. Soldiers, unpaid for months, survived by looting. Every roadblock became a toll gate, every gun a small kingdom. Amin responded not with reform, but with theatre, more parades, more titles, more threats of divine punishment against enemies of the revolution. The walls around him thickened. His security force swelled from a few hundred to tens of thousands: bodyguards, informants, fanatics. Even they feared one another. At night, gunfire echoed across Kampala as factions within the same army settled private scores. The line between loyalty and terror had blurred into one continuous scream. In 1977, a whisper became a plot. Some of Amin's own officers, weary of madness, attempted a coup. It failed almost before it began. The reprisals were immediate and merciless. Entire regiments were wiped out, families of the accused arrested, tortured, vanished. The prisons overflowed, and the Nile ran darker than ever. But the coup attempt changed Amin. He grew jumpy, sleepless, erratic. His speeches turned feverish, one moment charming foreign journalists with jokes, the next shouting about invisible assassins and divine visions. He began traveling with an entourage so large that cities had to shut down streets just to let him pass. Each journey became a procession of fear: dancers, soldiers, musicians, and a convoy of cars filled with guards, watching guards. His paranoia became policy. He claimed foreign conspiracies were plotting to destroy Uganda, that traitors were being trained across the border in Tanzania. In truth, President Julius Nyerere had simply given asylum to Obote and other exiles. But Amin needed an enemy to hold his collapsing world together. In late 1978, he seized on a pretext. After a minor border skirmish, he declared that Tanzania had invaded Ugandan soil. In response, he ordered a preemptive strike across the frontier. It was a gesture of bravado, not strategy. Tanks rolled into Tanzanian villages without maps, without air support, without a plan. The soldiers, exhausted and half-starved, fought bravely, but blindly. Within days, hundreds lay dead. The world watched with disbelief. The once celebrated strongman had become a parody of command, a ruler waging war not for defense, but to silence the ghosts in his own mind. Behind the fanfare and the speeches, Uganda was collapsing from within, its economy starved, its people terrified, its army bleeding itself to death. Yet on the radio, Amin's voice still boomed with conviction, promising victory and divine favor. Outside his palace, the winds were shifting. The border he had provoked would soon open again, not for invasion, but for retribution. And this time, the storm would not pass him by. The war Amin had unleashed returned to him like a wave, slow, wide, unstoppable. When Tanzanian forces crossed the border in late 1978, they came not as raiders, but as a disciplined army. Behind them followed the exiles, Ugandan soldiers and civilians who had fled Amin's purges and now marched home with vengeance and exhaustion in equal measure. What began as retaliation soon became liberation. At first, Amin laughed off the invasion. He appeared on radio boasting that his troops would drive the imperialists back to the Indian Ocean. He promised victory within days, but even his generals no longer believed him. The army he commanded on paper was no longer real. Its ranks were filled with frightened recruits and opportunists, its tanks rusting for lack of fuel. The elite units that once guarded him were now ghosts. Some had deserted, others turned on their own officers. In early 1979, as the Tanzanians pushed northward, town after town fell with barely a fight. The mighty Uganda army collapsed like paper in rain. Civilians began to cheer the advancing troops, offering water and information, guiding them through roads that had long been silent with fear. For the first time in years, People whispered names aloud again. Husbands, sons, neighbors, thought to be gone forever. Amin issued desperate orders from Kampala, demanding counterattacks that never came. He broadcast fiery speeches about divine protection, urging his soldiers to make a final stand at Jinja. But the soldiers no longer listened. Even his own bodyguards started slipping away at night, uniforms discarded by the roadside. The circle around him shrank to family, a few loyal officers, and the sound of distant shelling. On April 11th, 1979, the Tanzanian army entered Kampala. There was no grand battle, only confusion, smoke, and silence. The dictator who once filled the streets with parades was gone. Amin had fled hours earlier, escaping by car and then by plane, with his 5 wives and children, first to Libya, then to Saudi Arabia. What remained of his empire was ruin. Uganda's economy was shattered, inflation above 200%, a national debt in the hundreds of millions, hospitals stripped bare, schools abandoned. Between 300,000 and 500,000 people had died. Soldiers, teachers, doctors, farmers each, a life swallowed by the machinery of fear. In the days after Kampala fell, the city was eerily quiet. The gunfire ceased, but the air still trembled with memory. People emerged slowly from their homes, blinking at the sunlight as if the day itself were unfamiliar. They walked past burnt cars, toppled statues, walls pocked with bullets. Children pointed at soldiers, not in terror but in disbelief. No one cheered loudly. There was no triumph, only the hesitant relief of survivors. Women swept doorways, men reopened shops with shaking hands. A few old radios crackled to life again, playing music that had been banned for years. Life crept back like grass through ash. In those fragile mornings, Uganda began to breathe again, cautious, trembling, unsure what freedom now meant, but alive. The noise of one man's reign had finally gone quiet, leaving behind the sound of a country remembering itself. Exile did not humble Idi Amin, it merely muted him. When he fled Uganda in 1979, he arrived in Libya like a man stepping onto a different stage. Muammar Gaddafi welcomed him with ceremony and the promise of sanctuary. For a while, Amin lived grandly again. Parades, speeches, the illusion of relevance. He was still field marshal, still surrounded by bodyguards, still convinced that history was pausing only to catch its breath before calling him back. But time is merciless to men who mistake fear for loyalty. By 1981, the alliance with Gaddafi had soured. Amin's demands grew heavier, his entourage unruly, his presence embarrassing. Libya had its own ambitions. Uganda's ghost no longer served them. The dictator, without a country, was quietly asked to leave. Saudi Arabia received him next, not as a guest of honor, but as a pensioned exile. The kingdom granted him a modest villa in Jeddah and a government stipend. He was told firmly to stay out of politics. And so, the once loud ruler of Uganda faded into a routine of prayer, tea, and memory. He attended mosque daily, smiled for the occasional photograph, and watched the world that had forgotten him flicker across his television screen. Years passed like sand through an hourglass. His children grew up, his name faded from headlines. In 1988, he made a tentative attempt to return to Uganda with a small band of followers, but nothing came of it. The new government refused his entry. The former King of Scotland was left to wander his own recollections. By the summer of 2003, his body finally failed the way his regime once had, suddenly and without ceremony. He fell into a coma in July, kidneys collapsing, lungs weak. His family gathered in the hospital room in Jeddah, torn between duty and release. On August 16th, they made the decision his victims never could. They turned off the machines. Idi Amin Dada, once feared by millions, died in silence. There were no speeches, no soldiers, no crowds, only the soft hiss of oxygen fading from the room. Reactions rippled outward, uncertain. In Uganda, people spoke his name again, some in anger, others in disbelief that he had died so quietly. A few even whispered prayers for his soul, as if trying to make sense of the monster who had once been a man. Milton Obote, his old rival, offered the final epitaph, the greatest brute that an African mother has ever brought to life. There was no trial, no confession, no truth commission. The man who had ruled by terror never faced a court or a question. His death left behind a hollow justice, a silence where answers should have been. Uganda would rebuild, but without reckoning. The graves would remain unmarked, the stories half told, and somewhere in the desert light of Jeddah, the memory of a vanished dictator would linger, fading not because he was forgiven, but because forgetting was the only way to live again. The fall of Idi Amin did not end Uganda's pain. It only began its long recovery. When the guns went silent, the country faced the harder war: how to rebuild trust, how to live again among ghosts. Ministries had been looted, roads crumbled, schools forgotten. In the markets of Kampala, shopkeepers traded in whispers. Everyone carried two memories: the fear of what had been and the disbelief that it was finally over. Reconstruction came slowly, not from decree, but from persistence. Brick by brick, families repaired homes. Teachers returned to empty classrooms. Doctors reopened clinics without medicine, but with hope. The state itself was broken, but the people refused to stay shattered. Among those who returned were members of the expelled Asian community. Some came back from Britain, Canada, and India, answering cautious invitations from the new government in the 1,990 seconds. Their parents had left with nothing. They returned to find their old shops gutted, their family names erased from registries. Yet they rebuilt again from abandoned storefronts, rosebanks, factories, and trade houses. The hum of commerce returned to the streets like a second heartbeat. For many Ugandans, it was the first proof that life could move forward without forgetting. But memory is a difficult companion. The legend of Amin, his cruelty, his absurdity did not die with him. It continued to mutate in rumor, in books, in films that could not decide whether to laugh or recoil. Some tales were true, others grotesque exaggerations. Cannibalism, preserved heads, midnight feasts of horror. Each story turned terror into spectacle, feeding the same fascination that had once kept the world watching him. Yet the truth, quieter and harder, remains enough. Hundreds of thousands murdered, a nation hollowed out, power used not to govern, but to perform. Amin had understood that fear could be staged, that violence could be theater, and that sometimes the world would mistake it for strength. Uganda's story after him is one of resistance to that temptation, to rebuild without repeating, to lead without spectacle. In the decades since, the country has known both progress and pain, democracy and drift. But beneath it all lies a shared vow, never again to let one man become the state. Still, his shadow lingers, in history classrooms, in whispered family stories, in the silence before certain names are spoken. It is a reminder of how easily power can turn human beings into instruments of its will, and how fragile the boundary is between order and oppression. The legacy of Idi Amin is not only a warning, it is a mirror. It reflects what happens when fear replaces truth, when loyalty becomes currency, when a nation forgets to look inward until it is too late. And yet, amid that reflection, there is something else: endurance. The same people who survived his terror found ways to sing again, to build again, to love again. In their quiet labor lies Uganda's truest victory, not the fall of a tyrant, but the slow, stubborn return of humanity after him.